The waiter has just poured the wine when my stepmother reaches into her handbag. She does it slowly, deliberately, like someone who has practiced the movement in advance. Her hand emerges holding a cream-colored envelope, thick paper, the kind that comes from expensive stationery shops. She slides it across the white tablecloth toward me with one smooth motion, the way you might present a gift. Since we're all together, she says, this is the best time to be clear. I look at the envelope. Then at my father, who is watching me with the careful stillness of a man who has prepared himself for several possible outcomes. Then at my brother, who is already leaning back in his chair with a loose, comfortable smile that belongs on someone watching a film they have seen before and already know they enjoy. The restaurant is the kind of place my family only books when they want the evening to feel significant. White tablecloths, low golden light, servers who move between tables without making sound. Somewhere behind me, someone at another table laughs at something private and pleasant. Open it, my father says. My fingers tear the flap before I fully decide to. Inside is a typed notice. Removed from future inheritance consideration. The words sit on the page in clean black type like they are perfectly ordinary. For a second, the room tips sideways. I look at my father first, because some stubborn part of me still believes he will correct it. He doesn't. He folds his napkin once, precisely, and says, this is the best decision for the family. He says it in the tone he uses when he thinks a conversation is already over, calm, certain, the sound of a man who has decided before arriving. The family. As if I am not sitting 3 feet away from him, part of it. My stepmother adds, almost gently, we felt it was only fair to be transparent. Transparent. Like packaging cruelty in soft words makes it something other than cruelty. My brother takes a sip of wine to hide a smile, but not quickly enough. That smile lands hardest. Not the letter. Not my father's rehearsed calm. Because it means this was discussed before tonight. Planned before tonight. He knew what this dinner was when the invitation was sent. He accepted it anyway and dressed nicely and sat down and ordered and waited for the moment the envelope would appear. And he is enjoying it. The candles keep burning. The restaurant keeps being elegant. A server passes by and smiles at someone behind me. I hold the paper and try to remember how to breathe normally. That was when I understood the dinner had never been a dinner. It was an announcement. A performance staged in public because witnesses make things feel more permanent. The white tablecloths, the expensive wine, all set design. They wanted me to feel small inside something beautiful, because that combination is harder to recover from than feeling small in an ordinary room. Family invited me to fancy dinner to humiliate me and announce I'd been cut from their inheritance. My name is Lillian Brooks. I am the daughter my family expected to absorb things quietly. The practical one. The one who showed up early to every gathering because someone always needed help setting up. Who remembered every birthday and sent every card and visited when people were sick. My brother was the celebrated one. My stepmother was the family's image manager. And my father had a particular talent for delivering cruelty in the cadence of reason. Together, they had spent years building a version of the family that looked functional from the outside. Tonight, in this restaurant, they had decided to show me what they really thought of my place in it. What they didn't understand yet was that I had already started seeing them clearly. And clarity, it turns out, is much more powerful than their expensive envelope. Growing up, I was never the favorite. I understood that early and without drama. My brother Arlo was the favorite, the one who got the proud mentions at dinner tables, the one my father pointed to when someone asked how the children were doing. Arlo was effortless. Or rather, he performed effortlessness so well that my father chose to believe it rather than look closer. I was something else. I was dependable. The word sounds like a compliment until you understand how it functions in a family like mine. Dependable meant useful. It meant you could be counted on to absorb the inconvenient things, the administrative tasks, the emotional labor, the logistics of maintaining a family that didn't actually like each other very much. I helped my grandmother with her electricity bills for 3 years until she moved to assisted living. I coordinated my father's medical appointments when he had a health scare the year I was 28. I was the one who arrived early to events and stayed late, and no one ever thanked me for it because dependable people aren't thanked, they're expected. What I mistook for love back then was just an arrangement. They needed me useful. I needed them to notice me. Those two needs lived side by side for years without ever actually meeting. My brother Arlo had a gift for being forgiven. Not because he was particularly charming, though he could be when it benefited him. Because my father needed him to be fine. And when a parent needs their child to be fine badly enough, they do the emotional work of making it true regardless of evidence. Arlo forgot things and was forgiven because he was busy. He borrowed money and it was called temporary. He made a mess of a business arrangement that cost my father a significant amount, and it became a story about learning rather than a story about accountability. He had bought a boat with money he didn't fully have. My father laughed about it and called it ambition. The same year I asked for a small loan while switching jobs. My father told me I needed to learn to manage better. I sat with that comparison for a long time before I understood what it meant. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about us. It was about who my father had decided each of us was, and he had decided long before either of us had any say in it. Arlo was the son he displayed. I was the daughter he used. Those are very different roles, even when they live in the same house. My stepmother Renata entered our lives when I was 19 and Arlo was 22. She was precise the way certain people are precise, not as a personality trait, but as a strategy. Every word considered, every impression managed. She never raised her voice at me because raised voices leave marks, and Renata did not like leaving marks. What she did instead was smaller. She corrected me in front of guests. She retold old family stories in ways that repositioned me as the difficult one, the sensitive one, the one who always made things complicated. She praised my father's decisions loudly and my contributions almost never, or only in the particular way that makes praise feel like a diagnosis. She called my concern overthinking. She called my needs a lot. My father found all of this comfortable. He preferred Renata's polished version of family life to the messier version that had existed before. She gave him a story that reflected well on him. I gave him reality. And reality requires more work. For years I believed I simply needed to be more patient, more palatable, more something. It took me a long time to understand that the problem was never my volume. It was that I was asking to be seen. And they had already decided what they needed me to be. The first time inheritance was used as a weapon, I was 26. We were at a Sunday dinner at my father's house, the kind of weekly gathering that looked like closeness from the outside. My father was in a good mood, which meant the conversation had gotten loose and a little dangerous. He laughed and said, "Some people know how to build a future. Others just wait to be handed one." He looked at me. I had just spent the previous week helping him locate tax documents for a property he had forgotten he owned, found the paperwork, contacted the county records office, organized 3 years of filings. The week before that, Arlo had bought a second car he couldn't afford and asked my father to co-sign the loan. My father had done it without hesitation. But I was the one waiting to be handed something. I remember going still inside when he said it. Not angry exactly. Something more like recognition. The kind of feeling you get when you understand that a system you have been working inside has never been designed to reward you fairly, and that the unfairness is not an accident. It was the first time I really understood that in my family, facts were negotiable. Roles were not. People sometimes say, when they want to diminish someone's pain, that it was never really about the money. I have heard that enough times that I want to say clearly what it was actually about. For me, the inheritance was never only money. It represented something more specific and more important than that. It represented recognition. It was the idea that at the end of a life, my father would look back across all the years and see what I had actually contributed, not what was convenient to believe about me, not the version Renata had been quietly editing, but the real record of who showed up and when and what it cost. The inheritance was a placeholder for the belief that it would eventually matter. That a reckoning was coming where the ledger would finally be balanced. The letter in the restaurant didn't just tell me I was cut out. It told me the reckoning was not coming. That the ledger had never been balanced. That my father had looked at the record and chosen, consciously, to reward absence and punish presence. Not because he was confused about what had happened, but because he had always preferred the easier version of the story. And I was the harder version of the story. That is a particular kind of grief. I don't think there is a clean name for it. The candles keep burning. A server I don't recognize approaches the table with the particular professional warmth of someone trained to make every interaction feel like a small gift. He asks if everything is to our satisfaction. My stepmother answers before anyone else can. Perfect, she says. She does not look at me. I fold the paper once. Then again. I set it on the table beside my untouched wineglass. My hands are steadier than I expect them to be. That surprises me. I had not realized how much of my body had shifted into something quiet and focused while the rest of me was still catching up. I stand up. Nobody tries to stop me. Nobody says, "Lillian, wait," or reaches a hand across the tablecloth. My brother examines his menu. Renata adjusts her bracelet. My father says, in the mild, tired voice of someone managing an inconvenience, "Don't make this dramatic." Those 5 words follow me all the way across the restaurant and out through the heavy front door. Because that is the finishing move, isn't it? The injury is never the problem. You are never allowed to call it what it is. The only offense permitted in a family like mine is reacting to being hurt. The cold outside air hits my face. I keep walking. I cry in the car, but only after I've pulled over into a quiet street 2 blocks away. Not the composed kind. The ugly kind. The kind that comes from realizing you had been hoping, even at 34, sitting across from an envelope in an expensive restaurant, that it would somehow not be this bad. I sit there gripping the steering wheel and replay every second. The way Renata withdrew the envelope like a gift. My father folding his napkin. Arlo hiding his smile in his wineglass and failing. By the time I start the engine again, something has shifted inside me. Not healed. Not resolved. Something harder than either of those things. I had spent years telling myself that the family I had was, underneath all its difficulty, basically mine. That I belonged to it in a way that would eventually be acknowledged. That love, however imperfect, was still functioning somewhere beneath all the management and performance. The envelope had said, plainly and in writing, no. And the particular mercy of that kind of plain, written clarity is that it ends a debate. There was nothing left to hope for from that direction. Which meant there was nothing left to lose. For 3 days after the dinner, no one from the family contacts me. Not my father. Not Arlo. Not even a brief text from Renata performing the courtesy of a follow-up. The silence tells me more than any message could have. They had expected me to absorb it. To process it privately and then return to my expected position, functional, available, maintaining the infrastructure of a family that had just formally announced I was not valued. They had done this before, in smaller ways, and each time I had eventually come back. They were waiting for the pattern to repeat. When Renata does finally text, it is short and smooth. I hope once emotions settle, you'll understand this was necessary. Necessary. As though cruelty acquires respectability when you document it on good stationery and deliver it in a restaurant that doesn't take walk-ins. I read the text twice. Then I put my phone face down on the table and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window and watched the street for a while. I did not reply. This was the first time in my adult life that I did not reply to a family message, however awful, within a reasonable number of hours. It felt like stepping off a moving walkway. Strange at first, then surprisingly easy. My aunt called 11 days after the dinner. Not the aunt who had been at the table, Renata's sister, who spent the evening studying the centerpiece whenever I looked her way. This was my mother's sister, Ren. She lives 2 hours away and calls infrequently but always directly. Her voice was slightly lower than usual, like she was being careful about something. "Why a restaurant?" she asked. Of all the places. I laughed once, and it came out wrong, too short, too tight. "Because witnesses make them feel legitimate," I said. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother would have hated this." It was the first genuinely kind thing anyone had said to me since that night. Simple and real. And something about the simplicity of it opened a door I had not looked through in a long time. My mother. I sat down without meaning to. My mother, who had died 10 years ago when I was 24. Who had been practical in a way my father never quite understood or valued. Who kept records carefully. Who told me once, in passing, that you should always keep copies when family starts talking in legal language. I had smiled at the time, not fully understanding. Ren was still talking, but I had already started to go somewhere else in my mind. My mother died when I was 24, 2 years before my father met Renata. Her name was Edith Brooks, and she was careful in a way I now understand was her form of love. She kept files. She labeled things clearly. She believed kindness and clarity were not opposites. After the dinner, I started thinking about her differently than I had in years. Not just with missing, though I missed her, acutely and specifically in those weeks. But with the more focused attention of someone trying to remember things they had not thought to memorize. She had said something once, not long before she got sick. We were in her kitchen going through old paperwork together, and she had looked up from a document and said, "I've made sure you're taken care of, Lil. Not by your father. By me. Just make sure you know where things are." I had nodded and changed the subject because I was 23 and the conversation made me uncomfortable in the way conversations about death make young people uncomfortable. 10 years later, sitting in my apartment the week after a restaurant humiliation, I finally understood she had been trying to tell me something specific. And I needed to find the papers. I stopped attending family events. Not loudly. Not with an announcement or an argument or any of the dramatic responses that would have given them something to talk about. I simply stopped being available. The group chat went unanswered. The invitations received a brief, pleasant reply, "I can't make it this time," without explanation or apology. For the first few weeks, this felt like holding my breath. Then it started feeling like the opposite. I had a freelance financial consulting business that I had been building slowly, taking on work from a few old clients in addition to my regular job. Without the emotional weight of family management, the planning, the anticipating, the absorbing, I found I had more focus. More patience. Better results. One client told me I seemed different. More direct, she said. Easier to work with. I thought about that for a while. I had spent so much energy managing how I was perceived, softening my observations, making myself smaller, that I had transferred those habits into every room I entered. Without them, I was just myself. It turned out I was quite good at my job when I wasn't also simultaneously trying to become acceptable to people who had decided before I walked in. The boxes were in the storage closet at the back of my hallway. I had moved them 3 times without opening them. They were my mother's things, not the sentimental objects, those I had distributed properly after she died. These were the practical things. Tax records, warranties, files. The kind of material that feels too important to throw away and too adult to deal with when you're 24 and still trying to understand that your mother is gone. On a rainy Saturday, 6 weeks after the dinner, I finally sat down on the floor of the closet and opened them. Recipe cards written in her handwriting. A folder labeled household in blue pen. Copies of old insurance documents. And then, near the bottom of the second box, a green hanging file folder with a label that stopped my breathing. The label said, "For Lillian, if needed." Her handwriting. The same handwriting from every birthday card until she couldn't anymore. I sat with the folder in my lap for a full minute without opening it. Not from fear. From the sharp grief of understanding that your mother was still taking care of you, 10 years after she died, in a situation she had correctly predicted. Inside the folder was a legal envelope with a typed note clipped to the front. The note said, "Lil, I hope you never need this. But I know your father, and I know how families work when there's money involved. These documents establish a separate trust structure for assets that were mine before the marriage and remained mine throughout. Your portion is protected from remarriage, from later amendments to any will your father makes, and from what lawyers call family reallocation. The trust has a trustee who is not your father. His name is on the attached. Find him if you need him." I read the note 4 times. Then I opened the legal envelope. Inside were copies of trust documents, precisely organized, with a summary sheet at the front. My mother had set aside rental income from a property she had owned before the marriage, transferred into a trust with specific provisions for my benefit. Not a fortune. More than significant. More importantly, it was protected. My father's letter at the restaurant had removed me from his inheritance consideration. It had said nothing about my mother's. Because my mother had been careful enough to make sure he had nothing to say about it. She had built a separate door and handed me the key. She had just trusted me to remember to use it. I found the attorney named in my mother's documents on a Tuesday afternoon. His name was Gareth Osei. He had managed the trust for a decade without ever hearing from me because no one had ever told me to call him. When I introduced myself over the phone, he paused for one beat and said, "I've been wondering if you'd reach out eventually." He had read about the trust so many times waiting for this call that when I arrived at his office with the folder, he was already familiar with every document inside it. He read through my copies quietly, confirming against his own records, checking dates and signatures. Then he looked up. "This doesn't just protect your interest," he said. I waited. "The trust structure also limits your father's discretionary authority over certain shared family assets." He tapped one page. "Specifically, it creates disclosure requirements for income from connected property that your father has been managing, and based on what I can see, has been managing in ways that deserve a closer look." The air in the room changed. Not dramatically. The office was still ordinary. But inside me something recalibrated, like a room where the lighting shifts and everything becomes easier to see. My mother had not just left me something. She had built a structural correction into the family's finances. Gareth explained it carefully, because he was the kind of attorney who believed in clients understanding their own situations. My father's letter, the one delivered at the restaurant, in front of relatives, had been theatrical but legally limited. His control over his own estate was real. His ability to cut me from a will he was free to write was real. But my mother's trust operated separately. The assets it protected were never his to threaten or remove. His announcement at the restaurant had no legal authority over what my mother had established before she died. More than that, by making his declaration formally and in front of witnesses, my father had created documentation of a dispute. That documentation gave the trust legal reason to initiate a review of the shared assets Gareth was watching. In trying to humiliate me publicly, my father created the mechanism that forced scrutiny of his financial decisions. I thought of the restaurant. The way Renata slid the envelope with the confidence of someone who believed the performance was the whole story. They staged a public declaration. In doing so, they handed Gareth the legal justification to open the books. My father built the trap without knowing it. The second discovery came during Gareth's financial review of the connected assets. He called me on a Thursday with the careful neutrality of someone who has found something they expected to find but still prefers to describe accurately before drawing conclusions. My father had been drawing from income tied to family-managed property at a rate that significantly exceeded what the trust terms permitted for his discretionary use. Not theft in the dramatic sense. The kind of thing that happens when someone has been in control of finances for a long time, with no one watching closely, and begins treating flexible language in documents as blanket permission. Transfers categorized as household expenses. Distributions described as administrative costs. Income streamlined in ways that required a closer reading than anyone had done in years. Enough that, under formal review, the numbers would require explanation. Enough that the trustee had grounds to freeze further discretionary distributions until the review was complete. Gareth said plainly, "Your father has been treating this as his personal account." "It is not." I asked how long. "At least 6 years. We're still going through it." 6 years. The same 6 years Renata had been smoothing every family interaction. The same 6 years my brother received every benefit of the doubt. They had been protecting a financial arrangement, not just an image. My phone rang on a Monday, 3 weeks after Gareth sent the formal notice. Arlo. Which meant my father had told him. Which meant the notice had landed. I answered and waited. "What exactly are you doing?" Arlo asked. Not "Are you okay?" Not "What is happening?" "What are you doing?" An accusation shaped like a question, which was the family's preferred form of communication. I noticed, with some interest, that his voice had that particular edge it got when he was alarmed but didn't want to show alarm. The same edge he had when the business arrangement failed and he had spent 2 weeks pretending to be unbothered while clearly being very bothered. Reading carefully, I said. He paused. I heard him breathe once through his nose. Then he said something short and dismissive and ended the call. That was all. But it was enough. Because the question, "What are you doing?" only makes sense if something is happening that he didn't expect. And something clearly was. Gareth's notice had reached them. The review was real. The numbers were being looked at. My brother, who had sat at the restaurant and hidden a smile in his wine glass, had just called me in something very close to panic. The performance was over. Something else was beginning. Then came my father's message. It arrived 2 days after Arlo's call. A long paragraph, stiff and formal in the way that happens when someone has drafted something carefully with the help of their own instincts for image management. He used the word misunderstanding 4 times. He suggested that emotions had led to some overreaction and that the family would benefit from resolving things quietly and internally. He did not acknowledge the trust documents. He did not acknowledge the financial review. He addressed the dinner only to say that his intentions had been honest and that he hoped I could appreciate the difficulty of these decisions. Then Renata sent a separate message asking if we could resolve this as a family. That word again. Family. The rope they always threw when they needed me to come back to an arrangement that benefited them. For years I had grabbed it. I wrote back to both of them politely, said I was working with my attorney to understand the full picture, and thanked them for being in touch. Professional. Neutral. Impossible to quote selectively against me in any later conversation. My father did not respond. Renata did not respond. But a trustee meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. This time, I would not be arriving in a restaurant. This time, I would be arriving with documents. The meeting was held in a downtown office building. A mahogany table, a glass water pitcher, carpet chosen specifically to absorb sound and make the room feel more private than it was. I noticed all of it and thought, briefly, that my father had an instinct for choosing rooms that looked like authority. This room, like the restaurant, was meant to communicate control before anyone sat down. My father arrived in a navy blazer looking like a reasonable man unreasonably inconvenienced. Renata sat beside him, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her sleeve. Arlo arrived last and found a chair that didn't quite face me. Gareth opened the meeting by reviewing the trust documents. My mother's trust, its provisions, its current standing. He did this methodically, without drama, the way someone goes through a set of facts when the facts are strong enough to do their own work. By the 2nd page, my father's expression tightened slightly. By the 4th, Renata had stopped performing calm. By the 6th, when Gareth reached the section outlining the distribution discrepancies and their implications under the trust terms, the room had the quality of a room where everyone present has simultaneously understood that the conversation is not going the way it was supposed to go. My father started to speak. Gareth kept reading. The hardest blow was delivered not by anger or confrontation, but by mathematics. My mother's trust-protected assets my father had never been able to legally threaten or renegotiate. His announcement at the restaurant, made publicly and in front of witnesses, had created the exact documentation trigger that allowed the trust's oversight provisions to activate. And the financial review those provisions required had found 6 years of discretionary distributions that exceeded the documented authority. Not criminal, expensive, indefensible under the terms as written, requiring remediation. The trustee froze further discretionary access pending formal accounting. My father argued, using the words family and intention repeatedly, which told me he was improvising. Gareth responded with dates, amounts, and clause numbers. Arlo looked at the table. Renata had stopped smoothing her sleeve and was sitting very still. And my father, who had spent the better part of my adult life managing rooms with his particular brand of unhurried confidence, who had folded his napkin at the restaurant with the ease of a man who believed the outcome was already secured, looked, for the first time I could remember, like he did not have the next move already prepared. He looked like a man who had overestimated how much of the story he actually controlled. Nobody in the room rushed to help him find his footing. After the meeting, I stepped outside into October air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Not triumphant, not satisfied in the loud way that word usually means. Something quieter, something more like the particular lightness that comes after you have been carrying a weight for a very long time and then set it down, not thrown it, not destroyed it, just set it down on solid ground and stepped back. The meeting had not fixed everything. The financial review would continue for months. There would be negotiations and documentation and more attorney conversations. There would probably be a period of cold formality with my father that never fully resolved into anything warmer. But the version of reality they had been maintaining, the one where I was the difficult daughter, the excess weight, the one who could be publicly dismissed at an expensive dinner and was expected to recover quietly and return to position, that version had not survived the mahogany table and Gareth's careful page-turning. They had built a polished story about who I was. The documents had told a different one. And documents, unlike family dinners, cannot be managed by tone of voice. In the months that followed, I received my distributions. I expanded my consulting work. I rented a small office with my own name on the door. I built something. The strangest thing about the end of this story is that it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like finally being able to stand somewhere stable. My mother left me something real. Not just the trust. A record of her thinking, clear, careful, protective in the way love looks when it is not tangled up with need. She had known my father. She built a correction into the family's structure before she was gone, and trusted me to find it. What I found in that folder was not only legal protection. It was her belief that I deserved to be protected. And I hadn't even known I was looking for that until I had it. My father invited me to a fancy dinner to make me feel disposable. What he actually did was force the one action, the public, documented declaration, that activated the oversight my mother had built into the family's finances on my behalf. In trying to erase me, he handed me the key. I don't need my family to agree that I am worth something now. I don't need them to revise their version of the story. The documents have their own version. And unlike their dinner, it holds up under review.